You've devoted over 45 years to commercial real estate development, developed over 20 billion in real estate projects, 148 buildings, 34 business parks. Some of your developments include transformative and iconic projects like Gateway Plaza in Richmond, Virginia, and the North American headquarters of Zurich American Insurance Company.
You know, when I used to drive around, building things was just a passion. And I would literally drive around and I could see buildings popping up out of nowhere and know that there was something that was supposed to be there and we needed to figure out how to put it there. There's not a day that I can think of that I thought about this is how I make money. This is how I have fun. And the money comes along when you do a great job and have fun doing it.
Larry, thank you for being on the show.
Really happy to be here. It's an interesting proposition. I've not done one of these before, so let's see what happens. Should be fun.
You are the president and CEO of Seneca Commercial Real Estate and Chapman Ventures. You have a truly fascinating career and story. Can you give us a little background on how you grew up, where you grew up, and maybe when you first were introduced to entrepreneurship and real estate?
Yeah, happy to do that. So I wasn't born in St. Louis. I was actually born in Brooklyn, New York, but maybe lived there until I was one, maybe 1.5. My dad at the time worked for IBM, which in many circles is known as I've been moved, because we literally moved every 1.5 or 2 years. That's how you got promoted in corporate America in those days. And then ultimately landed here in St. Louis when my mom, I guess, was tired of moving. And so we moved to her hometown of St. Louis, and I've been here ever since. I was in high school at the time, always had little ventures going on. I always did a little contracting work. I've always kind of just been on my own, doing things on my own. So it's kind of natural to do that. And then when I was in high school and before I went off to school, I had the fortunate opportunity to meet Dale Perkinson and his family, became friend with his son. And then ultimately when I got out of school, went directly to work for his company called Clay Corporation, which back in the 60s and 70s was the developer in St. Louis.
So for folks that aren't familiar, can you give us some background on who Dale Perkinson was, maybe some background on Clay?
Sure. So Dale was the impetus behind a lot of different projects. He was the developer, for example, Earth City. You may have heard of Earth City. He did a lot of other business parks in Dorset and Progress West and out in St. Charles County. Back at the time, he was doing, one-off developments. He built a building for Western Electric, which you wouldn't know anymore, but at the time was a huge organization. We did a lot of speculative development together. And so Dale was probably the predominant developer. And I will tell you that just about every developer that worked in St. Louis from the 80s through the 90s and a little bit of the early 2000s probably came through Clay on their way to their own success stories.
Interesting. So I read a Business Journal article about Dale and Clay and the fact that Clay really created Earth City in terms of what we know it as today. What was your role in that development or the fruition or creation of what Earth City is today?
So Earth City actually predated me, but it's an interesting story. So Dale developed Earth City in the early 70s. And for those of you who have parents would tell you that in 1973, we had the gas crisis, long lines, inflation. It was the first time hyperinflation and hyperinterest rates ever hit America. And that forced him to give that property back to Ford Motor Credit Company, who had financed it. Even so, he kept doing developments in there, and over time, we bought some adjacent ground, which we called Corporate Woods, and developed around Earth City. And then back in 1990, Ford Motor Credit came back to Dale and me at the time and said, "Hey, will you buy Earth City back? We're not having any success here." And so actually on December 31st of 1991, literally before the clock struck midnight, we bought back Earth City, and we had a run over the next 5 or 6 years that probably developed 70% of what you see there today.
So that type of industrial development at that time, would that have been an anomaly? Like today, I feel like you see industrial sites, warehousing popping up all across the country. Was it a similar environment in the early 90s?
It was a new invention. So if you go back to a similar time frame when malls were invented for retailers, same kind of thing. This kind of industrial park was a relatively new invention, newly laid out, and Dale took advantage of that. and did a ton of them. And I've done the same after him. When you can create the land platform by putting in all the infrastructure and controlling that real estate, provided you've got the wherewithal to stick with it, now you can control the real estate transactions that go along with it. So you've created an opportunity to do a lot of deals. So it's sort of like if you buy an apartment that's empty and you fill it up. Now I bought a piece of ground that's empty and I fill it up. And each one of those represents another building I can build, or a sale I can have, or an opportunity to meet a new client. I mean, one of the greatest things about this business ever, when you're always doing new development, is you get to meet every kind of company in the world that do all kinds of things. You ask yourself, you do that and that's a business and you make money? It's crazy. And then we build a building together and become partners and everybody has a great time.
That's amazing. And I share a similar kind of passion for entrepreneurship and just finding out about different types of businesses. It's partly why I'm in the U.S. I'm born and raised in Canada. I came to the U.S. because of just the entrepreneurial environment here.
Yeah.
Can you speak to, if you can, or if you're aware of it, when did your family immigrate to the U.S.? Like, was it 3 generations ago, 4 generations ago? And were there any entrepreneurs in your family prior to yourself?
Well, I guess the answer is yes. I mean, on my mother's side of the family, her name was Luking. The Lukings emigrated to the United States in 1843. We know exactly when they came over. And they formed a company called Luking Transfer, which was a drayage and ultimately trucking business. And in the early 90s, it was actually the oldest continuous operating corporation in the state until they closed down in the late 90s. So I guess there's some of that in there. I don't know about my dad's side. I don't know exactly when they emigrated. He grew up in a little town called Saragordo with 300 people in it, and all he could wait to do is get out of there.
Sure. Got it. So the real estate development experience and entering that world really came with Lindclay. So was that when you made up your mind that you were going to devote the rest of your career to real estate development?
I don't know that I ever made up my mind that I devoted it. All I can tell you is that I noticed how much I loved doing it, and all I could do was think about doing more of it. And so, when I used to drive around, building things was just a passion, and I would literally drive around and I could see buildings popping up out of nowhere and know that there was something that was supposed to be there, and we needed to figure out how to put it there. And, what a developer does is they just decide something's going to happen, and then they figure out how to go make it happen. That's really what it is. It's sort of like an orchestra leader, but we bring all the parts together and go. And I can't tell you how fulfilling that is. I mean, you get to make up your life every day, and you don't get a roadmap in the morning. But man, it's a lot of fun figuring out what that map ought to look like.
So there's a legendary real estate figure, Sam Zell, who you're familiar with.
Yes.
And I would call you a legendary real estate figure as well. But he had a quote that came to mind when we first started talking about doing this. So he said, if you're a successful real estate developer, 50% of your return comes from real cash flow, and the other 50% comes from the intangible benefit of seeing your creation come out of the ground. Would you say you resonate with that? And it sounds like you do, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I hadn't heard that quote before, so thank you for sharing it first. Yeah, I think it's pretty accurate, although I might actually go, it's 80% the enjoyment of it and 20% the cash flow. There's not a day that I can think of that I thought about, this is how I make money. This is how I have fun, and the money comes along when you do a great job and have fun doing it.
That makes a lot of sense, and I'm sure that's why you're good at it, because it feels like play.
Yeah, it does feel like play. It really does. And, none of my kids want to do this, but they're all doing things they love to do, and they're all highly successful doing it.
And are your kids in St. Louis or?
Well, one is here right now. The rest of them have moved out. I've got them in L.A. and Denver and Florida, and one is here. And she's here because she's got married recently, going to have a baby, wants to be close to mom, and her job is one where it doesn't matter where you are. I mean, she's completely remote kind of a person.
Makes sense. And I think your career took you away from St. Louis for a little bit, and you're back now, which we can discuss in some more detail if that's right.
Yeah, St. Louis, we love it a ton. We'll do anything to help St. Louis that we can do, but it's a very difficult place sometimes to do business. Attracting new businesses here, bringing people to St. Louis is very hard. It's always been a business about moving the people around, helping them grow, and doing everything we can to keep them from leaving. That's been our mission here. We've never had more than 1.5% growth, maybe 2% in a good year. And, any really successful community needs to get up to about 3%, and then the world changes. Everything's completely different if you've got real 3% population growth and business growth, and we just have never had that here. So back in 2008 and 9, the Great Recession, I don't know how it impacted you, but it impacted a lot of people differently. To recover from that, there was very little opportunity in St. Louis. Of course, we kept doing things here, but the vast majority of the opportunity was out of town in markets that very quickly went back to the kind of 3% growth. And I would call it the smile of America. You go around the coasts and you go up into Chicago and places like that, and there was a lot more opportunity to do business. And so that's what we did to have a good livelihood during a period of time when St. Louis wasn't as robust as it could be. And frankly, I'd still be doing that. There's still more opportunity there. But by 2018, I said, I'm just tired of being on the road. I can figure out how to make enough go on in my hometown. I'm more interested in helping there than any place else. And I can do some other projects that aren't, real estate development related that hopefully will help the community at the same time.
And your projects really are transformative, so I can speak on behalf of folks at St. Louis to say we appreciate you being here. So just going back to earlier in your career, before we kind of get to the present day, when you were with Lynn Clay, it sounds like you were there from 79 to sometime in the 90s. Is that correct?
It's actually, there was a little bump in between. So okay. I was there from 1979, and then in 1983, 84, Dale sold the company to the then key executives. And so I left the company about 1985. I was on my own, doing my own thing. You may or may not know this, but in the late 80s, there was a little crisis in the real estate industry. It espoused the Resolution Trust Corporation crisis, and all of the S&Ls went out of business, or most of them. And during that time, whoever was running the company got into a lot of trouble, and Dale had to come back to try and save the company because he hadn't been fully paid off yet. He sold it on a installment note, I guess. And he asked me to come back and help him with that. And then in late 90s, early, sort of in 88, 89, it was pretty clear Lynn Clay wasn't going to survive as Lynn Clay. We had offices in Columbus, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Kansas City, and Denver. And we systematically shut those down, put new people in charge, and closed those businesses. And then in St. Louis, we decided, you know what? We're going to close down Lynn Clay and create a new company and just start from there, which we created Perkinson Realty Group. And that's the entity that did everything from 1990 on until Dale retired in 96, I think.
And the focus throughout that time period, for the most part, was office and industrial. Is that correct?
That's correct. Land development, office, and industrial. That was the primary focus of Lynn Clay. They did a few other retail developments in their early career, but that was the primary focus. And historically, Raj, you'll see that industrial has been the steady state. It's been the most consistent kind of real estate in St. Louis and most of the country too. And I would say apartments have been very similar, although we weren't apartment developers. We don't do heads and beds, but we're doing a little bit of that now. Got it.
And then post Lynn Clay and Perkinson, you were with TriStar, correct?
Yeah. So what happened was I left when Dale retired. I formed a partnership with Rod Thomas and Mike Towerman, and they had a company called TriStar. And so I joined them for a number of years. And that worked pretty well. In the early 2000s, right after the tech bubble burst, there's always a cycle going on in our industry. I decided to take a little bit of a break, and so I just was on my own. I started a couple little projects. And then my friend Bob Clark, who I'd known forever, he was a partner of mine with Dale, and we did a number of projects together, said, hey, we're going to form Clayco Realty Group to do development as part of the Clayco arm. And a year after I left TriStar, I went to form Clayco Realty Group with Bob Clark and Tom Schroyer, and did that for a number of years also.
And then it was more recently in 2019 you formed Seneca, correct?
Yeah, so what happened is Chapman Ventures has always been around. It's been around since 1980. And that entity had a couple of things. It was a place for me to do little offsite real estate deals. It was also the thing that held my real estate license. As you know, we have to be licensed, right? And it still holds a real estate license. So if we did something to earn a commission, that's what Chapman Ventures would do. But it doesn't do any real development business anymore. And then I realized that I'm, getting to be in my 60s, and I've got all these people working around me, and someone might say, well, if you disappear, what happens? And so on purpose, we created a company that had a name that wasn't mine, that had the opportunity for the small group of people to evolve the company into something that would go on after me and they could enjoy the benefit of. And so at some point in time, we'll rotate the ownership out of me into them and let them have a company they could do on their own so I can keep some good people at the table.
That makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like you're borrowing from what Dale Perkinson did.
A little bit. I don't know that, he just sold it outright. This is a little bit different than that. But in the end, I don't really ever see myself retiring. So the flip side of them getting the business is I have a place I can go if I ever want to work, right? They'll have to let me come in and do what I want to do, that kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So you mentioned a few times some of the previous downturns. You mentioned the mid-'70s, and then you said the late '80s, early 2000s-ish, late '90s. And
I'm happy to go through cycles with you. So
yeah,
the first one I lived through as a teenager was 1973, 74. And that's when we all remember gas lines and those kinds of things. You may not, but I certainly do. And then in the late 70s, early 80s is when we had hyperinflation. And so, back then it was kind of crazy. I mean, you could literally get a CD that paid 18%. It was nuts a year. And interest rates were out of control. But the flip side was everything cost so much more the next year, you almost could not make a mistake in my business. No matter what you paid to build a building in year one and year two, it was worth more because the next guy to build a building had so much more cost. And so you almost couldn't lose money. Now, cash flow was an issue, but you almost couldn't lose your value. So that was pretty interesting. I mean, my first mortgage on my house was 12%, and I thought I died and gone to heaven. It was amazing. And then Reagan got elected. They changed some tax laws that really improved the economy. And then the RTC crisis came about in the late 80s, early 88, 89, only because people were so optimistic, they did a lot of stupid things. And it just inflated and blew up in their face, right? They just thought everything they touched would turn to gold, and guess what? It didn't turn to gold. And so we went through another little recession then. The 90s were all pretty good, early 90s. And as you go back into the later 90s and into 2000, we had the tech bubble issue. And then 2008, we had the Great Recession. And then, now we've got whatever we got. I don't even know what you call it. But, it's pretty regular cycles you're always going to have in our business.
Can you compare today to any other time frame?
Well, I think I said this in the article you picked up when you decided to call me. One of the things that's happened is we've had such a long period of low interest rates that this higher interest rates have caught a lot of people off guard. And so in many respects, it's really challenging to younger business people that haven't been through the cycles and they weren't really prepared for it because they never knew to be prepared for it. And so I think what makes it different may be more psychological than real. I mean, to think that we're going to keep interest rates at 2 or 3% for the rest of your life just doesn't make any sense. There's no economic model that would show that would make sense. If we ended up with an interest rate environment that's in the mid fives, on average, a little plus or minus there, that would probably be closer to normal and people could adjust to it. I think there are probably people who would think this is as bad as a Great Recession because they weren't prepared for it, but it's not.
And by the sound of it, you don't think it'll get as bad either.
No, if you can come up with a plan to stay through it and live through the high interest rates and all the extra interest charges you're going to have, you will come out on the other end and it will get better and there'll be opportunity galore. I mean, there's always opportunity after a recession or after a cycle, always. And so the question is, how do you recognize it and how do you get prepared for it? And everybody's different. Everybody's got a little different market sector. But I think anybody who's got a business like mine should be looking for 6 months, a year, and 18 months down the road is really where they're going to get their opportunity. And how do I get myself ready for that?
As an outsider, because we're focused on acquisitions, not development, to me, it seems like developers are usually the first to fail or fall when there's bad times. And not all developers, but just like they're kind of the first domino, let's call it, to drop.
There's a reason for that. And there really is. I mean, if you think about what developers do, by their nature, by their definition, they've always got the most expensive thing on the leading edge. They've always spent the most money to advance the market. And so they've always out there taken the greatest risks. There's no question about it. And they're either going to be super successful or they're going to have a big problem. And you talk about acquisitions, developers need to learn how to do acquisition at the right time. So when I see a recovery coming, I've been a guy who does acquisitions after a recession because there's opportunity there, right? And so then you want to buy things right because something that was planned before didn't work. And I mean, that's the kind of thing I think you're doing or want to do, and it'll be easier to do as we go through a cycle.
Yeah, we're kind of positioning ourselves to be able to get aggressive with acquisitions and call it the next 6 to 12 months. With the last year and a half, we didn't do a whole bunch just because nothing made sense to us, at least, and we wanted to focus on operations and kind of setting ourselves up.
Well, in the last year where you were in this paradigm where interest rates were too high to be able to afford the money, and the prices hadn't come down enough to offset it. As you go through the rest of the cycle, interest rates may or may not come down, but the pricing will change to offset it and make it make sense. So deals you looked at a year ago may make sense a few months from now.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I would love to hear your thoughts on the way development has changed from the beginning of your career to today, like just in terms of access to information, technology, and the way you're underwriting or looking at deals. Because from my understanding, when you started in the business, it was hard to really get data on new markets or to really see if a development is viable. And that led folks to build just because the last person's development was successful versus today where you can pull, the new units under construction. You can pull household income information more easily. Would that be accurate to say? And have you seen it really change and develop over the years?
Well, technology, of course, changes everything. So, one of the things that has happened for sure is just the complexity of the transactions has become astronomically high, even though I don't know that it needs to be. It used to be I would have a closing book on a new development. It would have 10 documents in it. Now it's usually has 150 to 160 documents in it. And, all of that is people papering over the last mistake they made over and over and over again. So we've gotten to the point where we're doing that, and it just makes it harder to get in. I would rather it be easier to get in. So really smart people with really great ideas could get in who are kind of kept out only because they don't have the access to the information that they need or the education that they need. It's just hard. But back then, in terms of gauging the market, the market has always been a combination of what's the data say, lick your fingers, stick it in the air, and what does your gut tell you to do? And developers will go with their gut 99% of the time, and the 1% they don't, they probably made a damn mistake.
So even like, let's say in the 80s or 90s, if a developer in St. Louis wanted to build in, call it Nashville, where were they even starting their search for market intel?
First of all, we would go in and align ourselves with somebody who's got boots on the ground in the market, make a relationship with them and learn about their market. It would have been a big mistake to just blow in and say, we're going to conquer the world. Now, there's always an exception to that, and that exception is pretty simple. If the ABC company says, I need you to build me a new headquarters, I need it here, you don't care. You're going to go build for that company, and because their credit says you can, and all you now have to do is learn about local codes and customs for how you get a certain approvals and those kinds of things, which is not as difficult to do as you would think, but it does take doing some real homework.
So like you mentioned, ABC company, if they want you to build a headquarters or a building for them, how were those relationships being developed pre-internet? Was it conferences? Was it
brokers and industry organizations? When I first got into the business, you'd have an industry organization like the National Association of Office and Industrial Parks, okay? On a local basis, we never talked at all because we were competing. We didn't want to share information. So you joined these organizations to go on a national basis so you could go meet with people in other markets. They'd share information because they weren't worried about you coming and beating up with them, And now, I'd say in the last 20 years, that's changed. Everybody has been open. Everybody's been, and maybe it's because technology makes the information available anyway. I don't know. But we don't have those kinds of competitive things anymore, which I think is fabulous. We can all learn from each other. We can all get better together. There's always going to be competition, of course. Some people are going to win. Some people are going to lose specific deals. But I think the collaboration and sharing of information has gotten so much better. I've done my whole career doing what we call open book. I share everything with my clients of every nature whatsoever. It's usually disarming enough, but all I'm doing is building trust. And once you have trust, everything works great. Until you have trust, things can always fall apart.
And open book means just like sharing invoices, contracts.
I share
things
whatever
like
they
that.
want to see. I start by showing my pro forma. I show them exactly how much I'm spending, how much I'm getting paid as a fee, how much I expect to make. I just share all that with them. And you know what? There are other companies. They know they need to make a profit too. Nobody's going to hold that against you. If they think you're making too much, you talk about it. You talk about how to share the risk. And usually, if they wanted to say, okay, I don't want you to do that, I said, well, that's fine. Then you need to take on this part of the risk, so I don't care about that. It's just a good way to get on deal making speaking terms so that you really make progress to get the deal done instead of playing hide and seek and figuring out how to make the next dollar. It's just life's too short.
It sounds like having an abundance mindset and realizing that the pie is big enough for everyone and you don't necessarily have to cut corners or screw anyone is what's really helped you throughout your career.
Yeah, we're just going to make more pies. There's just no end to it. You just keep making more. I mean, that's exactly right. Yeah, trying to slice something up into little pieces is not a good idea for anybody.
Makes sense. So you've done just a countless number of projects, again, throughout the country and in St. Louis. Do you have any project that you would consider to be your favorite? Like, are you able to pick a favorite child?
I would say the answer to that is no. But in terms of the different kinds of projects to do, one of the things I've gotten the reputation for over the years is doing things that are really hard or that people didn't think could be done, or they've got a real problem that needs fixing in some way. And those are the most fun to work on, right? Because they really don't have an answer when you start. You got to kind of figure that out. And so I focused on those. The other thing I focused on is helping cobble together economic development incentives so that you can make a project go that otherwise would not. They've been abused like crazy all over the market, but if you use them right, I'll defy you to find my name in a paper associated with one of those programs that said I abused it or took advantage of anybody, because they're there for a reason. They're there to help certain kinds of situations, and when you know what those situations are, you can do a great job for everybody, and everybody wins.
So when you mention economic development incentives, are you referring to like historic tax credits, TIFs, or just all of the above?
All of the above. So, I mean, and new ones you can make up. So tax increment financing is a huge tool. I did an article in the Business Journal a couple of years ago, and I was trying to make the case that we're all sitting around holding back our incentive programs like we got to save them for a rainy day, and I'm screaming, it's raining every day, let's get to work. But all these programs, Roger, set up so that everybody wins. It's not like they're going to give you a check and you run away and go have a party. It's we're going to give you the opportunity to recoup a certain amount of your costs. If you build the project and you're successful, now you get a reduction in costs so the project makes economic sense. In the meantime, the city or the county or wherever you are gets a better tax base. They get new jobs. They get all these other intangibles. And the money is always greater than if the project didn't happen. And all these people would argue, well, the project's going to happen anyway. Well, all you got to do is look around. No, it's not. Once we get to 3% growth, then you can stop that stuff. But until you do, you got to be doing it all day long. I did a project in Spartanburg, South Carolina. I remember this. I went over there, and I knew I was going to have to do something to bring the project together. I had no idea what it was. And the guys rolled out the red carpet, and they said, we're going to introduce you to our economic development guys. So I went over and met this guy. And the name of his organization was the Economics Futures Group. Not the Economic Development Group, the Economic Futures Group, because they recognized by doing this was going to plow their way into a future where the city of Spartanburg, the county of Spartanburg had not done really well over the prior decade, and they were bound and determined to do it. And it worked great for everybody. We ended up going forward with a project that might not otherwise have happened, and they ended up with million-square-foot size buildings, which there was no ability to do until we brought that project along.
And were those industrial buildings?
These were all industrial warehouse type buildings, yeah.
For a project like that, is that a situation where you found the ground and you wanted to develop that ground into an industrial park, or how did a project like that come about?
So when you're in the development business, you align yourself with a lot of different brokers, and the brokers know who you are and you know who they are. And brokers are opportunistic. They're trying to marry opportunities they see with other people. And so there's usually a steady stream of information coming in. The brokers will get us opportunities to compete in deals. The Zurich American, McGuire Woods law firm, which was the Richmond, Gateway Plaza Richmond headquarters. Pfizer, we did the Pfizer plant out here in Chesterfield. Those were all brokers that brought us to the table to compete for the business. A lot of times they'll bring us this great piece. They say, here's the greatest piece of land you ever saw in your life. There's nothing like it ever. Don't believe that ever. But there's always another piece of land, by the way, Raj. I'm just telling you. Anybody tells you it's the last piece ever, it's just wrong. But that might be a great piece of ground and great for an opportunity. In the case of Spartanburg, we're a few miles down the street from the BMW plant that was built there. There was a robust industrial market, office warehouse, and e-commerce warehouse, and it's very rough terrain. And so there weren't any of these big million-square-foot boxes, but the market could absorb them. And so what we used these tools to recoup enough cost to take what would otherwise be land that's really irregular and flatten it out enough to do these big things. And so we all won as a result of that.
That's awesome. And you touched on an interesting point. You said there's always another piece of land. So I think you were involved in the Costco development in University City.
Yes.
Okay. So if someone were to look at University City or Clayton on Google Maps, you would think there's no land. How did that come about from idea to develop?
Well, this one's a little different, although I've done stuff like that. So I've done a number of developments. I don't know if you've heard of North Park. Mm-hmm. North Park was the airport bought out most of the homes that were there. There were still a few hundred homes that hadn't been bought out. And we used TIF and eminent domain to buy all the properties, clean them all up, and create flat land for development or new land for development. That's similar to what happened in University City where Costco is. A lot of older commercial buildings, all obsolete, a lot of little individual homes, things like that. University City knew it needed to do something to improve its economic outlook and to reestablish its commercial base. And it first started out being a project that Novus Development was doing, Jonathan Brown, and then he got to a point where he wasn't able to push it across the finish line. And when I say we have interesting things where we get called to say projects, he reached out to Bob Clark, my partner, and Bob reached out to me and says, okay, Larry, we got to go fix this thing. So we came in and we bought Jonathan out, finished up the Costco. We're building a bunch of other stuff around there right now. So you see all those little stores down there, Panera, First Watch, Chipotle, Raising Cane's, Chick-fil-A, Cat's Bank, that kind of stuff. For
a deal like that, is Costco leasing?
In this case, Costco's the owner of their own site.
Okay.
And so what they did was they bought the site and built their building, and their real contribution was they generate so much in sales tax that we can use that money to pay for all the rest of the stuff. That's what the TIF does. They capture that retail sales tax.
Got it. That sounds like a home run. And I know Costco is very selective on their sites and where they decide to place, new stores, warehouses, whatever you want to call them. Right. Were you involved at all in bringing them to that site as well, or selling them?
The answer in this case, the answer is no.
Okay.
However, when we got involved, we learned that Costco actually looked for a location here 20 years ago. They just never been able to put it together. And so the West County location happened, the one over in Illinois happened, and the other one, it was sort of, they had to wait until they could get what they really wanted. It was a complicated piece of real estate. Their property that they're on now is only about 16, 17 acres, but it's probably 30 pieces of property that had to be assembled to make that piece.
Wow. Yeah, that must have been quite the headache. Or
it can be. It is a headache.
A little bit of brain damage to put together a deal like that, I would imagine.
Right.
So industrial and office are the two primary sectors that you kind of
Although I'm
have
doing more,
on.
I'm doing more apartments. When Maxine Clark and the CRG people started the Del Mar Divine project in the city on Del Mar, just a little bit east of De Bolivar, they needed some help, and I came in and helped take that project across the finish line. So it's up, 100% leased, both the apartments and the office, and we're looking at doing the last phase now. So I'm doing more apartments on the way. I've learned how to do HUD deals. I don't know if you're doing HUD deals. I hadn't done them before. They're interesting. So, I may do some more apartments. I don't know.
So when you say HUD deals, you're referring to big A affordable housing?
Actually, it doesn't even have to be affordable. HUD has a loan program that is pretty attractive. If you can get it underwritten properly, the government, backs the loan. So when you go to sell the paper to bring the money in the door, it's pretty economical by comparison. It's going to be the best rated paper that you can get. And then HUD turns around and they will allow you to finance it over a 40-year period of time. So it brings your payments down versus a 30 or a 25-year. And it just makes the project more able to underwrite. And that's any new project that they'll approve.
Got
Doesn't
it.
need to be affordable at all.
So we haven't done any HUD deals, but we were close to pulling the trigger on a HUD deal. Ended up backing out because of where rates went. This was maybe 3 or 4 months ago, but have done Fannie and Freddie deals, which are somewhat similar. Just you can't stretch out the amortization as much. Those are 30 years.
Right.
So on our end, typically what we'll do is we'll finance the acquisition with a community bank.
Right.
And then once we have the deal stabilized, we have the NOI where we think we can take it, then we go Fannie, Freddie, or potentially HUD.
Yeah, and that's one way to do it. But the other thing that HUD will do is they'll actually finance the construction too. And you can lock both those rates when you close on the construction loan.
How are you typically financing non-apartment deals? Are you working with community banks or is it some other sort of financing?
If I can work with a community bank, I will. They're better relationship people. They're much better to deal with. But most of them can't do the size that I need. And so I either have to find a partner or a participant, or we just have to go somewhere else. In today's market, traditional banks are really not stepping up right now. The Fed and the market has seen to it their liquidity is gone. I mean, if you think about the last 10 years, when was the last time a bank asked you for deposits? Now that's all they're asking for because they don't have readily available funds to lend without turning around and borrowing it. And that's not a good situation for a bank to be in. So everybody's looking for deposits. So it's hard. And so we're doing other different things. We're looking for more joint venture partners. We're looking for debt service funds that are foreign market funds that are different. And that's just where you are right now. And the other thing is, as I said, we're just not doing as many deals to start right now. We're queuing ourselves up to do some more. But to go back, if I could do every deal with one of my local community banks where the relationship's so great, I would absolutely do that.
So you say like the community banks can't necessarily do your size of deal.
Yeah.
So with your size of deal, that's what opens it up for like some of the debt funds and things of that nature because they can put more money out of the door and it's easier for them. Is that right?
Well, so banks are highly regulated, lots of rules on how they can loan money, and they do have limits on lending based on their assets, right? So a lot of these little local community banks, they'll have a max lending of somewhere between $10 and maybe $20 million. So if you've got a project that needs $50 million, it just doesn't work. The debt funds, on the other hand, are generally not banks. They're generally not regulated. They're private equity of some sort or another, and they can make up their own rules for whatever they want to do. And so it's just different. I don't know how to say it any other way. The banks, on the other hand, do have, and I think want to help the community that they're in, where the debt funds are pretty agnostic about it. But you got to do what you got to do if you want to make a deal. If you've got a really good fundamental deal, Raj, what I would tell you is, if you go looking, you'll find the money, both the debt and the equity that you need. You will.
So find the deal first and find the money later.
I don't know how to find the money if I don't have the deal. I don't know what to tell these guys I'm going to do with their money if I don't have a deal.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When you were like early in your career as an entrepreneur, so not with some of the companies you've worked with or partners you've had, did you find it hard to get the capital in hand to make the deals happen?
Well, I got to tell you, the 80s was such a different world. It was so less regulated. I mean, Raj, I will tell you, back in the 80s, if I had a good deal, I could go to closing, I could borrow 110% of cost, and I could pay myself the full development fee on the first day I closed. You couldn't do any of those things today. None of it. You could do it without any equity. Not anymore. So it's just a completely different world. So the answer was, at that particular point in time, no. They were more reputationship oriented, and the reputation was good, so you kind of got to do what you wanted to do.
That's fascinating to hear. And if that was the environment, why weren't more people active in?
They were. In fact, so many people got active that blew up in their face, and that's when we had the crisis of 88 and 89.
So they essentially folks...
Everybody thought they were a developer, and guess what? They weren't.
Right.
It's a very complicated business, believe it or not.
So they stopped looking at fundamentals, and they were essentially just looking at the fact that they can borrow.
Hey, there's a deal. Look at that pro forma. It's beautiful. Pro formas don't do deals, but it was beautiful looking pro forma for sure.
Speaking of pro formas, like early in your career, were people doing more napkin math versus like the complicated Excel, underwriting that takes place today?
I think there was a lot of that. I personally always did both. I mean, I can remember doing my projection programs, in BASIC and Fortran. And there was a company back in the early 80s called Project, and they were writing real estate software. And I actually wrote a bunch of their software for them in the process of writing my own deals. And they formed that company and went out on the market. 3 years later, they were gone because there's so much evolution of little things like Excel changed the world, right? And all these other software programs sprung up like crazy. But for a while, they were the only software company like that you could plug in. But I will tell you, in the long, long run, all those analyses are great. And if you're going to bring a partner on that want to see a real sophisticated internal rate of return analysis, you got to do it. But the basic back of a napkin is still the most powerful number. And if you know what all the underlying numbers mean, that'll tell you as much as any other math problem that you're ever going to do.
How many years in would you say someone should or could feel comfortable with their own gut and back of the napkin type of math?
I don't know.
In my humble opinion, I would say at least 5 years of being fully.
It sounds reasonable. I never really thought about it that way until you just asked the question. I guess that's reasonable. I mean, how long does it take to get comfortable with your own abilities? I don't know.
Yeah, you'd have to get the reps in for sure. When would you say you went through your most challenging period in the development world? Like we talked about multiple downturns. Was there one in particular that you weren't sure you'd make it out of?
I mean, the very first one was 88, 89, and I thought I'd made it out of it, and in hindsight, I hadn't. I had made deals with all of my creditors to be fine, and then one savings and loan changed hands, and the fellow I was working with died, and his family took over, and they decided to sue me, so I had to file for bankruptcy, which I did, and then I made a deal with everybody except those two people to pay them off, which I ultimately did, so we were all fine, and those two guys who forced my hand didn't get paid.
You wouldn't be the first developer that filed for bankruptcy.
No.
Do you feel like in America versus other countries, if you have experience or an opinion here, bankruptcy is almost worn as a badge of honor among developers and entrepreneurs if they make it back out the other side?
I don't know. I don't wear it as a badge of honor. I was always pretty angry at myself that I had to succumb to it, but I really had I had my hand forced, and I had a family and other things I needed to do. And to me, the consistent statement I've made with every creditor I've ever had is, we work together, you're going to get all your money back. I know I have to do that, and that's what we're going to do. And that's what I've done with all of those people. I would never take bankruptcy as a way to make a new deal. That's not right. And so I would have a problem with that. At the same time, having come through it and gone to the other side, I can tell people who are worried about it that it doesn't mean your world's over. You can make it through, and you can come to the other side, and you can have a great reputation.
That's very helpful to hear. I think it's especially going to be helpful over the next few years as we do potentially face some challenges and maybe some folks do get in trouble. There's always a way to work through it.
Right. Raj, I say this to a lot of people. I don't know if I've ever said it to you. There's only one thing that has any importance in your life, and that's your reputation. Nothing else matters. It just doesn't. And that reputation extends to everything. And what it means is what you do when no one's looking, right? And all I can tell people is bankruptcy is not an escape. It may be a tool you have to use to get to the next point so you can be successful and you can do what you said you're going to do. But if you use it to just get over, I'm not sure it's a good tool to use. Now, sometimes you just don't have a choice, and I get it. And you will come out the other side and you will be fine. And literally after 7 or 10 years, people will forget. And the only reason it ever comes up is that every now and then I get a questionnaire that makes me go back through my whole life and talk about it again. I've got a little one-page thing that explains what happened during the bankruptcy, but everybody knows. But I would tell you that you just have to find a way to do the right thing, even if that means that, and you'll be fine.
I appreciate you sharing that. On the topic of reputation, I'm sure your reputation, like you said, with lenders is a guy that will do what he says he'll do, and he'll pay you back. What's your reputation, or what do you think your reputation is with like general contractors, other parties you're negotiating with? Because from my limited experience and just in my opinion, development can be a bit of a cutthroat world when you're dealing with general contractors needing to keep them on schedule, on budget, and needing to squeeze costs if and when you can in order to bring projects in on budget again. So what do you think your reputation is? Do you think you're a hard negotiator? Is it just that you treat everyone fairly and they want to come back to you and work with you on other projects?
I'd like to think it's the latter, and I'm hopeful that's what it is. One of the things I always try and do is say, okay, I know the shoes I'm in. What are the shoes you're in? And really try and understand what's going on there. So if we talk about contractors for a minute, I'm not saying I can always do this, but one of the things I always try and do is pay them as fast as possible because they got to turn around and pay all the people that are working for them. And so if I can make them have an easier life, I owe them the money. So figure out how to get them as fast as possible so that they can do their jobs. And then if you do that, they'll be more likely to come help you if you have a problem and you need them to stand up or come to your job first or do whatever. And so if you think about that with all these other subcontractors and contractors that work for you, you'll get a good relationship with them. I'm not saying you can always do it, but you have to try your best to do that every time. I also just tell them right up what I'm expecting. The thing nobody likes is surprises. And I've been doing this long enough where I can pretty well anticipate all the things that are going to happen during a job. So I sit down with them on the very front end and say, listen, this is the position I'm in. I know the position you're in. This is what I need you to do and commit to this. These are the risks you need to take. These are the risks I'm willing to take. And we're going to hold each other to it. We're not going to have any, crying, and I'm not going to tolerate any change orders unless I come and ask you for something. And as long as you make all that crystal clear, you'll be fine. And they just have to decide how you're going to price the deal. I've often probably left a little bit of money on the table because it was the right thing to do again. I don't go after every single nickel out there, Raj, because it's not worth it. But I do expect people to do what they say they're going to do. And if they don't, then we're going to have real problems.
That makes sense. And I've heard that paying contractors as quickly as you can from a few other development folks as well. And your reasoning behind that makes so much sense. They're at the end of the day, they're essentially loaning the developer capital indirectly by
their time.
Yeah.
They bought things, they put on your jobs, they need to be paid. I mean, there's all kinds of things. I mean, contractors take a real risk going to work for you. But they're willing to do that because they're going to be able to do what they want to do every day. They're going to make a nice living doing it. And hopefully you'll have a great relationship. But this all gets back to being open and honest about everything you're doing and not trying to play shell games with people. It'll work better for you, I promise you.
Earlier in the conversation, you mentioned developers always kind of being on the forefront of pushing rents, product, whatever the case is. And then you also mentioned you getting involved in apartments. So personally, I feel like in submarkets, it's submarket specific, but in some markets across the country, Class A apartments seem to be overbuilt or on the verge of being overbuilt. Do you have an opinion on the apartment market in general at this time?
Raj, if you'd asked me that question 2 years ago, I'd tell you that, yes, we're on the verge of being overbuilt, but they keep building them and they keep leasing them faster than I would imagine anything was possible. Now, if I look back at some of the market studies that I've read, it predicted this demand would be there. But I just blew off the market study as just whatever they needed to do to get their bank loan, right? And maybe they were right about that. I'm pretty surprised, I wasn't in the apartment business, but I watched it a little bit. I would say from the 90s to the 2000s and even into the early 2010s, you didn't see any rent growth in the apartment market in St. Louis. The rent was pretty much the same through that whole period. And now in the last 3 or 4 years, you're seeing real rent growth, and vacancy has not gone up because of it. I'm not sure I know what's going on. So I would be hesitant to say it's going to be overbuilt because I thought that already happened, and guess where we are? Now, maybe you're seeing something different over here on the Illinois side. I don't track that. But on the Missouri side, it's shocking how many units are getting leased up.
So surprisingly, and I shared this with someone else as well, CoStar had a report like 2, maybe 3 weeks ago The Metro East is leading the St. Louis region in rent growth, and occupancy is like 96%.
Yeah.
So it's strong.
Yeah, but yeah. I mean, I don't know how to answer your question. I mean, I would have thought something would be going on, but it doesn't seem to be happening. So there must be a paradigm shift in the way people want to live.
Sure. And then there was a paradigm shift in the office sector.
Right.
You were on the cutting edge of developing office buildings that are attractive to the people working there versus to the companies or employers necessarily. Can you walk through your edge at West development and your thought process behind it?
Yeah, happy to do that. So this is long before COVID, but it's a little bit of serendipity at the end of the day. I was talking to an office broker, name happens to be Tom Ray, and we were talking about the market. And I've done a lot of office buildings. You know, I don't know how many of my buildings have been office, but quite a few. And we were saying, okay, if we were doing something today, what do we do? And I said, well, what we want to do is we don't want to do an office that maximizes the usable square feet and all those other things. What we want to do is create an environment that will put the tenants in the building in a position to win the war for attracting the best talent imaginable and creating the most productive talent. People have been put in cubicles, all sorts of bad things have been happening to them. So we literally took 30% of this building and made that common element space for the use of the tenants, and at the tenants, but the occupants, the people who actually live in that building every day. And then we went out of our way to make it super user-friendly. And that was our goal going in. We had to get a lot more rent for it. We were charging $10 a square foot more than any of the office space around us. But even during COVID, we managed to get that rent to 90-some-odd% occupied because we were delivering on what we said we would deliver on. And the people who moved in were happy to pay it because they realized it was not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things, but they were getting better employees. Employees wanted to come to work instead of not wanting to come to work. And all these things really benefited them. So I think you'll see more of it. In fact, I'm told there's probably a dozen buildings around town that are being retrofitted to basically copy this because they want to retain the tenants that they have. And guess what? The actual company that leases space from you, they don't have to think about it. It's already there for them. They can focus on their core business and not have to think about how they make their employees happy.
When you mentioned some of the amenity space, what did that look like? What were some of the amenities you put in there to benefit the occupants?
So all kinds of things. There's areas for socializing and gameplay, you know, shuffleboard, outdoor putting greens, bocce ball court, a half-court basketball thing, so some of that kind of stuff. Then we had lots of little escape rooms. We had big living rooms everywhere, but little escape rooms. We had a bunch of phone booths. They didn't have phones in them because you already got to them, but they were soundproof, so you could have privacy to go have a private phone conversation. Lots of little breakout rooms, so people could do that. Fitness center, a big multi-purpose room that would get sometimes used for yoga classes, sometimes used for other stuff. It could then all of a sudden bump out, and now the tenant could have a 60-person meeting down there if they wanted to. So it was a space where they didn't have to have a big, giant conference room for big things. They could come down. We had a coffee bar with a live person in it, so you could go get a cup of coffee, do those kinds of things. And then just generally made it super comfortable, feel-good space to be in. You know, it just, when you walked in, you had this sense of, God, it's really nice to be here. Let's figure out. And then I just have a thing like front doors, automatic. You shouldn't be touching a door to get in and out there. Bathroom doors, you don't want to handle. You push in, you push out. You know, little things that just make it more user-friendly. And then when COVID came along, guess what? I'd already touched a bunch of the buttons already. And so, you know, almost virtually all touch-free services. We already had plasma filters in our HVAC system that killed microbials, not just MERV filters for dirt and particulate matter. So it was pretty good.
That's amazing. So you were early in industrial and clearly on the cutting edge of office. What would your thoughts be on the next cycle or the next decade? What do you think will be a big trend or some of the big trends in commercial real estate?
I've been thinking about that, and I'm not sure I can tell you just yet where I'm concluding, but here's the thing I will say needs to be in your thinking. We live and have for some time in the experience economy. And so whatever you do has to be based on the experiential impact to whoever it is. And I don't care whether it's office space or industrial space or whatever, there has to be something that engages you as part of the experience to want to be part of whatever that is. We did little things like 9 Mile Garden and now Frankie Martin Garden. I don't know if you've heard of those places, but they were ways to take part of what was otherwise a traditional development and do something that was more user friendly, right? They really weren't money makers. They're probably never going to be money makers, but they're a lot of fun and people enjoy it. And it's that kind of thing. I don't have a project I'm going to kick off tomorrow, but those are the kinds of things I'm thinking about.
Our maintenance manager, he actually lives close to 9 Mile.
Oh, does he?
And he goes there every weekend. So for him, I think it's become almost like a third place, if you will, which I think we're lacking as a society. Just that third place, aside from work and home, where people can connect with others.
Yeah.
I think that'll be a big trend in commercial real estate, whether it's coffee shops, town squares, things along those lines. Do you have any idea of what may become of the mall sites that are either currently being shopped or will be shopped in the next decade? Like, you have a lot of indoor malls that have failed or will fail. Some of them are becoming high-end mixed-use developments, some industrial parks.
Yeah.
Do you think the majority are going to go one way or the other, or any opinion there, just location-specific perhaps?
Well, of course, you've heard location. Just location can affect everything, of course. And the demographics around you will always drive what you're able to do and not do. That's why you can have really robust retail and dead retail all the other places, right? There's some places where the internet's never going to take over the full retail experience because of the ability to spend money and the desire to have the tactile experience of doing that. I don't know how to really answer that question.
Sure.
What do you think?
So I think it's location specific. I think if you're in a high-end suburb like Chesterfield, for example, mixed use is the way to go. And then I think if you're in, let's say, an outlying area, a small town, a place that really had no business having an indoor mall in the first place, probably industrial park or part industrial, part smaller retail, something along those lines. I think that's probably the natural evolution of some of these sites.
A few years ago, I got presented with Jamestown Mall, as everybody has done a million times. And my recommendation was scrape it and put industrial in, and maybe you could put a little bit of retail around the perimeter that was possibly supported by the community. But, there's just not enough people living up there. I think that's finally what they're going to do. A lot of that stuff is going to get scraped off, and specifically the functionally obsolete. But the Chesterfield Mall, I agree with you, would be a great mixed-use development someday if you can get control of it right. Mall ownership's very strange. Typically all the big stores are owned by those stores, and then the operator of the mall owns the mall. So not anybody owns everything. So it's hard to figure out how to pull all that together sometimes.
It's funny hearing you say that's hard to put together when you mention like the University City site, for example.
I know.
That would seem a lot more straightforward than that. But I understand, there's more complexity than would meet the eye.
Yeah, good or bad, when you're doing a land assemblage, it's pretty simple. When you've got something like that, you've got all these people with all these legal rights that are baked into all these documents that you have to unwind. They see value in those rights that don't create any value for your project. It's just simpler in what the trade-off numbers are and the number of moving parts when you buy 100 pieces of ground, or even in the case of North Park, which I think was more like 400 some odd pieces of ground that had to be assembled.
Wow. How many years did that take?
Let's see, North Park, all the assemblage took about 3 years, I guess. Maybe a little longer for the outliers, but about 3 years.
It sounds like, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, but it sounds like in order to be a successful real estate developer, reputation is key, and also you have to be forward thinking and think in terms of years, maybe even decades, not days or weeks or months. Would you agree with that? And then two, what would you say is the biggest piece of advice you can give a potential real estate developer?
So the first thing you said was exactly right. I think you got to have a great reputation, but let's talk about what real estate development is real quick. The typical gestation period for a real estate developer is 2 to 3 years from the time you have the idea to the time you can really turn it into some money, okay? So you need to be able to be patient, and you need to have unwavering tenacity during that period, because if you don't move at lightning speed, even though you're not going to see a payday for 3 years over here, you'll never get to that payday over there. So you have to work like you're behind schedule every day, knowing you're not going to see any results of that for a good long period of time. And so you got to have a lot of patience, a lot of tenacity, and you got to know that that's going to be true. If you can start with that premise and have the resources around you to get through that period, then the other thing I'll tell you is plant as many seeds as you can. Don't just work on one project. Try and do 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 so that when they ultimately become something that makes sense, because not all of them will, even though they're a good idea, then over time you keep planting seeds and harvesting seeds. And when one doesn't come together, you'll have another one out there, some of that you can kind of pull in and nurture to the finish line. You just have to keep all that stuff going. Have someone you can talk to and have a good, I wouldn't say a partner, but whether it's a mentor like I had with Dale or somebody that they know, make sure they're around to give you guidance and counsel. One of my best partners is a fellow by the name of Tom Mohan. People will know him. And the reason he's my partner is he's my alter ego. He views the world almost 180 degrees differently than I do. So it keeps me from drinking too much of my own Kool-Aid. You can really get in trouble believing your own shit. I'm sorry. That's a perennial problem for a lot of people. So you got to have someone else there that thinks the world completely different so you can just test yourself. Am I going about this right? Everybody already knows what they know. What they don't know is what they don't know. And you should be spending all your time trying to figure out what is it I don't know that I should be knowing. I already know this. That's good. Put that over there. Focus on what you don't know. That's what not enough of us do. And so I would recommend we do a lot of that.
That's a great piece of advice. Thank you for sharing that. We like to end the show with what we call the hole-in-one, which is your greatest piece of advice for just anyone to either implement in their business or their personal life. Now, we covered real estate developers, but if you were to give like your number one life or business advice, what would that be?
For one, live by the golden rule. Absolutely. Everybody says it, but it's really meaningful if you can really do it in real life and live that way. Be patient, be as kind as you can be thoughtful, don't ever give up. And I guess one thing I would tell you is if you have a great idea, don't tell anybody. They're going to try and talk you out of it and you'll never get it done. I'm
sure you've had quite a few instances where people tried to talk you out of some of your developments.
Most people tell me most of the stuff I've done is crazy. Good thing they turned out to be wrong.
Right. Well, that's very helpful to hear that people have doubted someone like yourself who's just been so successful and done so many amazing projects, and you were able to persevere and not listen to the naysayers.
That's funny.
Where can folks learn more about you or your company?
You can go on our website, which is senecacre.com. It's not going to be particularly helpful right now. It's being redone because we're deciding to go do some changes. We brought some new people in and things like that. You'll see them there. You're always welcome to call me, and I'll give you my number, which is fine. People call me all the time, which is 314-952-7790. I pick up the phone, talk to people all the time. That's what I did with you. If you think about it, you just reached out, and I did that. And if you get on my website, you'll see my email address and things like that. And so if you want to talk about something, I'm happy to chat with you a little bit.
Before we end the show, I do got to ask you about that.
Yeah.
How do you find the time to talk on the phone when people call you directly? And also, how do you kind of filter through your calls to not have your time be wasted?
Well, mostly I don't answer every call I don't know. So if they leave a message, I'll call back. But it's really funny, Raj. When people call and leave messages, you get this intuitive sixth sense you should call them back. Not because it's going to be beneficial to you. It just sounds like a good idea. And so you do, and good things happen. So I just make the time. I'm on the phone a lot. People tell you I'm never off the phone, but that's obviously not true. I have a lot of work to do. But it's just for reasons I can't explain. We all have intuition moments, and it says call that back. And I like to be helpful if I can be. If someone wants to waste my time, you can tell right away, and you can end it and go from there. But if it's somebody who generally is interesting and wants to learn something, help them.
I love that. And I will say that your ability to answer the phone, to say yes to things was very evident with your willingness to come here today. Mm-hmm. So thank you so much for your time, Larry. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. I've not done this before, so it was great. Thank you. I wish you the best of success with this thing and your company. It's awesome to be here.
Thank you. Appreciate it.